First order of business. If anybody is interested in doing an internship with me, like Sarah did last semester, like Lindsay's doing this semester, if you really know this stuff and you enjoy it and you want to get better at teaching and helping, even if you're interested in allied health, playing more will make you better at the game. So see Lindsay after, and if you're interested in doing this in the fall. I just want to remind everybody that you have the PDFs or on Moodle of the materials. I don't read from slides. I mean, you wouldn't need me if I just gave you a book and tested you on it, right? So my job is to give you the information, give you the story, and then I'm going to tell you about the story, and I'm going to help to develop that story. But I just want to remind you that you have all the materials in multiple ways. You have a visual, so that way you don't have to sit and write everything. You have a start. Like you have a start with the stuff, and then if I give you specific analogies or if I give you certain examples, you can fill in those gaps. And obviously, you can watch the lectures as needed, but I try to keep you as much as you can so that you can listen to my stories and learn that way. Again, I'm not saying don't write, don't record. I'm not saying that at all. But a lot of times, I think sometimes, especially when I'm emphasizing things, like guys, make sure to. And those are the ones who really have to lock in on, especially for the test. So you're accountable so far. We did ankle, right? We did subtalar. We go over why we call it dorsal implantar. We did the knee last week. I do want to touch upon open and closed chain. It's a term you guys have probably heard several times, whether it's in the clinic or in the field. This is another basic way of saying illusions. Open chain is when I talk about it, it looks like it's moving, and it is. That's traditionally open chain stuff. It looks like it's moving, and it is. And the closed chain is going to be when maybe it looks like it's not moving, but it's not. And in other words, open chain, distal parts move about proximal parts. And that's most of the time how things move. The door always moves about the wall. That's kind of open chain. Closed chain is when the distal part is fixed and the proximal part moves about the distal. So this is just a layman's term that you probably heard before that describes some of these illusions. Open, small part moves about the big part. Closed, bigger part moves about the small. All right, went over the knee and we talked about the major illusion of the knee, and that happens in rotation. And today, game on. We're going to go into the hip joint. Okay? Hip joint is our first dabble into a triaxial ball and socket joint. That means there's a lot of movement options, and with motion, more options comes more illusions. But we're going to try to break it down piece by piece, joint by joint, plane by plane, illusion by illusion. The first thing I want to point out is with the ball and socket, we've already covered sagittal, right? In the fetal, out of fetal, flexion and extension. We've even covered the illusion, right? Flexion and extension. It looks like it's not moving, it is. So really all we have to cover is transverse and frontal. We already have a head start on the transverse. We did that with the knee. Remember, the knee's a modified hinge joint, right? And when the knee is flexed, we can say, hey, right knee, spin laterally or spin externally. Same rule is going to apply with the hip. Hey, right hip, spin laterally, spin externally. So the same concept, same rules apply that we had with the knee versus the hip. Okay? Now, reminder, what is the hip? The hip is the articulation, the ball and socket articulation between the femur. Okay, so femur, the ball part, and the socket is made up of 3 separate bones that are fused. They're fused. The ilium, ischium, and pubis. Remember that in biology lab. So these fused three bones of the pelvis form the socket, the acetabulum, and the ball fits into the socket. So it looks like it's moving, and it is. We have the flexion and the extension. Today, I'm going to go over the lateral and the medial, or external and internal. And then at the end, I'm going to teach you how abduction and adduction is really a frontal plane version of flexion and extension that we call ab and adduction. It's lateral flexion. I'm going to explain all that to you. But all the consistency is our joint motions have purpose to them. Because if you try to go it off of angles, which angle? The inside, the outside, going away, but then all of a sudden I'm coming back, it gets all confusing. So if you just keep it in mind to purpose, it makes things a lot more transparent. Okay? All right, so let's go into transverse plane of the hip. So my right hip can have lateral or external, medial or internal, just like my knee. My left hip, lateral or medial. Remember last class I talked about the mirror effect, right? The mirror effect where it looks like I have I have two different global rotations. Globally, they're spinning differently. But joint motion isn't about what the room sees. It's about what's happening inside. So locally, they have the exact same motion. Double doors opening, double doors closing. So this is bilateral hip, external, bilateral hip, internal. Okay? Does that make sense? Remember, for the knee, I said if you ask someone to do a cartwheel to the right, cartwheel to the left, spin to the right, spin to the left. Or our appendages are sides of sides. The lateral side is the right of my right. The lateral side here is the left of my left. So they're mirrors of each other. So in the mirror, if I do this, the mirror is going to do that. Make sense? Okay. So if I ask my right hip, hey, right hip, spin laterally, wouldn't it spin to the outside? To the lateral side of the hip? That's why this is lateral rotation. This is what's happening. Internal medial, external lateral. Okay. Now, here's the problem. Problem is, you guys, and I'm included. I'm not just saying you guys as if you're on an island. I was you. I came to undergraduate here. I sat right there in the corner for this class. We are taught motion only from that open chain, basic small part moves above the big part. That's all we've ever been introduced to it. And as I keep saying, human movement is not just, it looks like it's moving, and it is. So let's look at, I teased this during the first week of class, but let's look at how the illusion of right hip external would look like when I move the sockets about the ball. So the first one I was doing this. No problem, right? Now I'm going to move the socket about the ball. And it's going to look something like this. Right hip, external rotation. Here to there gets me to the same place, to the same hip position as from here to there. Gets me to the same place. In fact, do we agree this is anatomical for my hip? Well, if I do this, and I say, hey, hip, come home, wouldn't I have to internally rotate to get it back? So that means I had to externally rotate when I left. Because we're taught small piece moves about the big piece, our brains want to give credit to anything that appears to spin laterally as external. That's the problem. Example. External, internal, external, internal. You got that. But what happens when I move the socket in the same global spin as the ball? It looks like I had external, but I didn't. I had right hip internal. External, internal. Socket about the ball. This is not external rotation. In fact, how would I have to rotate my hip to go back to anatomical? I'd have to externally rotate it to go back to anatomical. It means I had to internally rotate when I left. Does that make sense? Would you say that's one of the biggest hooks? Absolutely. Remember in anatomy, we had these landmarks, right? These anterior and inferior iliac spines, right? These bony landmarks. So that's a great point, Lindsay. I like to use my thumbs as a reference to our landmarks. We keep doing this. I use my patella as a landmark. We use the medial. You can use landmarks if they're local. We don't want to use global landmarks. We don't want to use the ceiling, the floor, the sides, the front. We don't use that. But we can use things inside of our body because joint motion is change of local landmarks, of local bones. So watch. My thumbs represent my anterior iliac spines, right? If I do right hip external, notice my leg is lateral to the socket. Lateral to the socket. Medial to the socket. Medial to the socket. Does that make sense? Okay. Bilateral, hip external, bilateral, hip internal. That's not a problem, but it's really cool. When your feet are weight bearing, when you're closed chain, the distal part is fixed, you cannot have significant bilateral internal or external because friction is preventing you from doing that. But what you can have is one twist one way and the other twist the other way. In other words, you can spin the merry-go-round if they're doing opposite motions. They can't do the same because you'd have to snap it in half. Who knows what this is? The pelvis, right? The pelvis, or the pelvic girdle, is all the different articulations of the pelvis. It's a pretty cool and special place here because what the pelvis is the pelvis. If we were going to build a skyscraper, we wouldn't do it in South Louisiana per se because our ground's not very. Crawfish build skyscrapers here. Our ground's very soggy. It's not very. It's not hard enough to build a foundation. But New York, Chicago, and New Orleans is kind of an enclave because it has a solid bedrock. But if you're going to build a tall skyscraper, don't you need a solid foundation? Here's our solid foundation. There's our skyscraper. So this needs to be a real solid, rigid foundation for us to build our skyscraper upon. Okay? So what I mean by that is, notice your right and left hip, there's two separate sockets, but they are joined. They can't be, you can't split this pelvis and move each socket independently. They kind of have to go along for the ride. Unlike our shoulder girdle, where I can do left stuff independent of right stuff, because the foundation is so important down here, my right socket is connected to my left socket through the sacroiliac. An analogy I thought of to explain this is you have like twins, independent people who are related, obviously very similarly. That would be like our toes, ankles, like my right ankle and my left ankle. They're both ankles. They're both darn near exactly the same, but they're independent of each other. I can do right ankle stuff independent of my left ankle stuff. My right knee is totally independent of my left knee. Can they do stuff together? Sure, but they don't have to. One could do cross country and the other can do drama club. However, when you get to the hip, hips are more like Siamese twins, the famous Siam twins from Siam. That's why they call them Siamese twins. They were famous circus performers. And so the pelvis, the analogy here is that you still have some independent movement. You can still have independent movement of the left hip and the right hip, but when you move the socket of the left, the socket of the right has to go along for the right. It can't independently move because you literally have to separate the pelvis to do so. Does that make sense? That's going to come into play when we get into illusions and pelvic girdle rotations or pelvic girdle tilts. So that's very important to understand that the hips in open chain are independent of each other. I'm going to give you examples. I could do left hip flexion. I could do right hip flexion. But if I do right hip flexion because I move the socket, the other socket has to move with it. Now notice I didn't say I had to have the same hip motion, but I can't take the right socket and do this and make the other socket do that. The sockets are connected through the pelvis. Does that make sense? Okay. So, right hip external, right hip internal. Let me move the video to make sure we get it. Right hip external, right hip internal. Left hip external, left hip internal. Right hip external, right hip internal. Left hip external, left hip internal. You get two illusions in that. You get, it looks like it's not moving, but it is. And you get, it looks like it's moving, but it's not. So in other words, if my left hip stayed in anatomical position, I could totally do this, and it's still in anatomical position, but it might look like it's spun laterally. Guys, it's okay to say, I don't quite understand. Can you please repeat that or find another way to explain? I'll do it again. Yes, sir.
Would your ankle be like
It, not always. I was going to get there, but I'm glad you did. Because sometimes there's going to be times where I can hide my ankle, and my ankle actually looks like it's coming in, but it's because my hip is spinning out. It's a good lesson. If we're going to do references, we need to make sure those references are on the bones that articulate the joint, not beyond, because beyond can trick us when other joints are in different positions. Does that make sense? So to answer your question, it can work, but it doesn't always work. It doesn't always work. When I'm standing here, it's a great reference to have. But I could do this, and all of a sudden I don't see my foot at all. I still need to be able to understand what's happening at the femur relative to the acetabulum, the socket. Great question. All right, guys, here's the hardest ones. I'll be happy to do it as many times as we need. Watch the video as many times as we need. Both feet on the ground. It is impossible for me to move my right socket with both feet on the ground and not my left socket. If I take my foot off the ground, then I could just move my right, or I can just move my left. But when both feet are on the ground, friction is preventing some things from happening. So if I'm here and I do this, I had right and left hip rotations. I'm giving that information to you. I want to see if we can practice and determine which hip did what. Okay? I'm going to do it for all three sides. This is a good practice. Start, finish. I want you to tell me how my right hip rotated and how my left hip rotated. Start, finish. Don't worry about the knees, because we're not having that conversation. We're having a hip conversation. We analyze joint by joint. I'm not disrespecting knees, ankles, subtalar. It's just we're not talking about them right now. We're having hip conversations. Start, finish. Stand up. All right? I'm going to mirror everybody and make sure we're on the same page. Hands on your hips. Spin your pelvis and look to your right, but keep your feet on the ground. And you should notice how your right hip is now rotated relative to the sockets, and your left hip is rotated relative to your sockets. I'm asking you guys to see if you can see, watch, let me show you another way to put it, how they're spun, how they're twisted. Start here, spin your pelvis. It's like your pelvis is spinning to its right. You keep both feet on the ground. Your hip had to rotate one way. Your other hip had to rotate another way. And I'm seeing if we can figure out using landmarks. In this case, you could totally use the feet. You could I didn't mean to say you can't. It's just there's going to be some times where you won't have that as a reason. Okay? When you got it figured out, you can sit down. Take your time. This is where learning happens. The answer is right hip internal, left hip external. Where are my baseball, softball players at? And you don't even have to play. Anybody watch baseball, softball? Awesome. Who's your team?
My team?
Yeah, well, who you like?
Oh, I like.
Good. That's all right. That is the right answer. That is the correct answer. I'm a Mets fan. But think about if somebody's batting and they're batting right-handed. When that lead leg plants and they rotate their hips, really what they're doing is internally rotating the left. And this right is literally just a kickstand that's keeping the bike from falling over. But this is internal rotation, even though we may think it's lateral. This is the same as this. This is the same as that. Does that make sense? Do you see why it's confusing? And you see why with practice, we will unconfuse it for you. So the answer was right hip internal, left hip external. Feet could 100% be used as a landmark in this case. Again, not every time are we going to be able to have the feet. So we have to be able to see what's happening. Femur relative to socket. Fall relative to socket. Okay. All right. How about speaking of illusions? Let's do this one. Sitting down, and hip rotation is, again, where femur rotates about socket. So if my knees are flexed, note how when my elbow and my knees flex, globally they travel two different ways. In other words, my elbow in anatomical flex is anterior to start, and my knee flex is posterior to start. It's a really weird conundrum because rotationally they actually follow the same rules. This is both internal. This is both external. What I did here is no different than doing this. As the top part goes to your left, the bottom part's going to go to your right. And that's how things rotate. As this side goes here, that side goes there. But the illusion is that because people see the foot go out, they want to think the hip is spinning out. Does that make sense? So if I'm sitting down and I rotate my hip like I'm going to cross my legs, during an hour-long boring meeting? It's not here. This is not internal rotation of the hip. Does that make sense? My hip is spinning laterally. Make sense? Internal, external. Internal, external. Does that make sense? So if I were, let's see if I could, I'm going to give a practical example. Every night, at the end of the night, my wife and I talk about our day, and we'll get into, a typical, position, we're just talking about our day, and, all right, guys, I'm not afraid to make an idiot of myself for education. But watch the, I don't want to even give you a heads up, but just try to analyze how my hips would be rotating when I do this or when I do this. Which one was this? Internal, good. But you can see how your brain might want to just say external because you see the feet go out. You see what I'm saying? This is internal hip rotation. This would be the exact same position as if I did this. The only difference is I flexed my knees. My knees have nothing to do with my hips. This would be absolutely externally rotating. Internal, external. Guys, I'm telling you, that type of question is gonna be on your test. Like I'm literally playing poker with my cards out. And most of the students who are gonna miss it are going to go off of those instincts to say, but I thought the foot was going out, or unfortunately with human movement, we don't always move the small piece out of the big piece. All right. Horse. Beat that dead horse. Now let's go to front plane. To me, and I'm going to, after I give this analogy, I'm going to toss it over to Lindsay to see if she has any insight. But forgive me, I just think the best way to teach this is to give an analogy with the shoulder because they're the same joint. They're the same classification of joint. They're obviously not the exact same. One's a shoulder, one's a hip. But they do the same things. Fair enough? The shoulder, though, has more range of motion, so it allows me to give this analogy better for the shoulder, and then we just apply it to the hip. Here's my analogy that I spent 2 hours last night thinking about. Guys, I take teaching very seriously. Like, I love to do this. I love to come up with analogies. I know they're not all going to be winning, but I care. All right, so check this out. Y'all have heard of Wheel of Fortune, right? They have the wheel, the traditional wheel. If we spun the wheel in the transverse plane, the bankrupt sign after 180 degrees can be here. Duh. How many of you have ever seen The Price is Right? Okay, on this one, the wheel spins in a different plane, right? One was like this. The other is more like sagittal spin. However, we can, instead of, I think, what did they have? They didn't have bankrupt, but that was a word like where you lose all your money. But the same concept, going in the sagittal, we could spin it and it could go to the other side. Meaning, transversely, I could take this and go here, or frontally, I could take this and go here. I can get to the same place in two different planes. This is what all that means. Flexion gets you in the feet. I can take the sagittal road or I can take the frontal road. Now, the frontal road, when we get into the shoulder, has a twist that has to happen to get me to the same place, but the general motion is the same. Flexion gets you in the fetal. Lateral flexion can also get you in the fetal. Some people refer to frontal plane movements as lateral flexion. We don't, because flexion is reserved for sagittal, and it can get super confusing if you start using flexion in a lot of places. But I want you to see the similarities of sagittal, frontal, and transverse. Apple, banana, strawberry, sledgehammer. Some doesn't look the same as the others. Sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane. What's the difference? Two of those three had general motion. There was rotation and translation. I'm making something go up and across. But in the transverse, I'm just spinning. I can take, be realistic, I could take 50-pound dumbbells. I'm not doing this with them, and I'm not doing that with them. But I could do this with them all day. So note the similarities. Sagittal, frontal, but ultimately they're trying to get me to the same place, just different roads. So that being said, we already have hip flexion and hip extension. Now we're going to add lateral flexion or abduction. You see how it's trying to get me eventually. Obviously, my hip doesn't allow as much motion. That's why I start with the shoulders, to show you that they're trying to get you up there. Lateral flexion, frontal plane flexion is what we refer to as abduction. And going away, frontal plane extension would be further away. Now, name these motions. I have a guess. I think it was Satan. And the reason is because they sound so close. I mean, they're literally one letter off. And for a dyslexic, a B and a D. So I'm warning you. I'm telling you. How many of you, going back to the twins question, how many of you grew up or have twins somewhere in the family or friends that are twins? Okay. There's like the ones that look alike. That's like maternal, I think, and then the fraternal. I forgot which one is which. But I graduated high school, known them my whole life, with a set of twins that look nothing alike. They didn't split. So they're not identical twins, in other words. But you know what their mom and dad named them? Heath and Keith. And so it only took me 15 years to learn their names, not because they looked like, it's because their names sounded so close together. Does that make sense? That's ab and adduction. Two totally different functional movements, just like flexion is the opposite of extension, just like internal is the opposite of external. But they sound so close that it gets extra tricky differentiating between ab or lateral flexion from lateral extension. They sound so close. And I think that's why a lot of students will miss it on the test, because you just ab and add it. It's just literally one letter. And so when we're practicing, I'm going to do a lot of ab and because I'm trying to emphasize a D or a B. Really trying to emphasize it. On Wednesday, I'm going to get into using the clock as a reference, which we've already done before, right? Where this is the same as this. Remember that? Okay. So Lutheran-wise, ab and add. Right hip ab looks like it's moving, and it is. Right hip ab, it looks like it's not moving, and it is. Same motion. It looks like it's moving, but it's not. That would be my left hip. Because if my left hip stayed in anatomical, relatively straight line. See the difference? So my left hip might look like it's abducting. But if there was no change in that articulation, in that hip, it's going along for the ride. Does that make sense? So the left looked like it was abducting, but it wasn't. The right looked like it wasn't abducting, and it was. Right hip ab, right hip add. Left hip ab, left hip add. Get it? Now, if extension gets you further away from fetal, flexion from extension to extension from flexion to, we're going to follow the same exact rules for ab and adduction. Abduction from, adduction to, right hip adduction from. You see how I'm further away from lateral flexion here than I was when I was here? You see that? I'd have to abduct to even get back to where I started. So I had to have adduction from anatomical. Guys, this is a very important thing we're going to develop. How our sockets move our hips. If you're standing in line, you may start off weight bearing, evenly distributed, but if you're like me, eventually you're going to shift your weight on one leg, and then you're going to shift your weight on the other. We're going to be able to analyze and tell you exactly what's happening. My right hip is adducted. My left hip is abducted because my sockets are here. And then after a while, I get tired of that and I shift my weight on the other side. My left hip abbed and my right hip added. It's subtle. And then eventually what's coming, which is even cooler, is how my trunk has to tilt and bend in order to keep my eyes and my shoulders level. In other words, if my pelvis, my sockets are tilted like this for me to have the ab and the add, and my trunk was in anatomical, I'd actually be here. So we're going to eventually get to see how the trunk is going to kind of compensate. As our pelvis is trying to tilt us one way, our trunk sways back the other way to keep our shoulders level. It's going to be really, really cool. And we're going to practice it a lot because it's easier to see the peripheral stuff. It's a lot harder to see what's happening here. But this is why this stuff is so important. There's a growing trend in therapy, rightfully so, about like pelvic floor rehab and pelvic floor exercises. Kind of have to know what's happening at the pelvis. And the pelvis is where the sockets are attached. And there's a lot of stuff happening here. Right. Let's right now, and I'm telling you, I'm suggesting stay up with the information. If you haven't started learning the ankle and the subtalar, do it. Because if you wait, remember your second test is everything. Everything. So if you wait until the end, it's going to get confusing. It's going to get tough. Trickiness is a function of your understanding. If you know it, it's not tricky. I had 2 100s on this test. You realize how important, and I wasn't one of them. It'd be impossible to make 100 if it was a flip of a coin, is what I'm trying to get you to see. It's a function of understanding. So we have to stay up with it. We have to eat the apple and little bites. We have ankle motion, plantar and dorsi. We have subtalar In transverse torsals, that's the inversion and the eversion. That's what you're going to have to know for the test. Just the sum total of the medial and the sum total of the lateral, mostly the frontal plane. And then we go into the knee. It's a modified hinge. We have the flexion and extension of the hinge, but then when we bend the knee, we allow some rotation. We have to, because if we didn't, when we cut and plant, we'd rip our knee apart every time. And in fact, when people do cut and plant and do tear their knee, that's hyper. You had hyper external. You went beyond your normal range of motion. And you plucked the string too hard. String popped or frayed. And then the hips. We are not going to rush through, relatively speaking. The hips we're going to spend a couple days on because there's a lot of illusions happening here, okay? But you can help me help you by staying up on the stuff, practicing the stuff, going through the motions like we did at the beginning of class. All right, guys, stand up. So if you're rewatching videos, try to practice as I do it, because I think if you can see it on yourself, it'll be a heck of a lot easier to identify on the test. I think so. Linz, any feedback on what we talked about so far?
So I guess, like, if you can't see the motion, or you don't think if there is motion, or you're trying to figure out if there's motion at this hip or whatever, like I said, from flexion and extension, you can always put your hands here and see if your hand is moving. Same thing here. If you want to do abduction and adduction, you can see. So if he tilts his hip, you can kind of tell which one bent and which one stayed the same or kind of curved. Now transverse is a little bit different, but you can also use your hands here. So you can tell, you can always just look down and see this is anatomical, and then what your feet or knees are at compared to anatomical. Same thing with adduction and abduction. You can put your hands out and you can see, like, if this is anatomical, you come in, it would be adduction, and anatomical and go out will be abduction. So I like to use my hands a lot to see if there was actually motion, if it was moving or if it wasn't moving, and what happened.
I'm so glad you brought it. And that's what's great about this kind of community that I like to foster, because people have different ideas and they come from it. And as long as those ideas work, then it may work for some of you. I'd never thought of that before, especially like how your fingers moving relative to your palm will kind of show you whether if you flexed, you moved, or if we did this illusion, right? There was no change. Yeah, that's really, really clever. What about when you were learning the difference between ab and ad? Was there anything special, or you just had to grind it into your head to not get them mixed up because they sound so similar?
Right. Everybody knows that rule, abduction.
Let's go.
Like where you're getting abducted.
Oh, wow.
And then you're adding, but I don't want to say adding midline, because once you get here.
Yeah. We don't like midline in here.
I say if it's not abducting away, then so I don't really like that.
Just to what we mean is that if you say abduction is moving away, what happens when you keep moving and you come back to? Because again, a lot of these motions are taught to you linearly using global references, and it's a rotational thing using global reference. So one of the reasons we don't like to use the away or towards is because on a test, I might do something like this. You cannot tell me that was the same motion. Well, why wouldn't they? They both came towards. Well, these both came towards. So you're basically saying that this is the same as that. It's not. It's about the spin. And that's where we're going to use the clock, the mirror effect of the clock. This is clockwise from how you see it, regardless of if I'm coming towards or going away. The spin is the same. From 6 to 12, regardless of if I'm going away or coming back, it's still the same spin. And if I have that mirror, if I have that clock in a mirror, I see 6 to 12 the whole time. So the spin has to be the same. So in terms of just out of curiosity, did you emphasize ABAB? Because you know how in class I'll be like ABB or ABD, any of that stuff, or you just kind of had it down, AB is different than AD?
I guess it just like for previous experience
Gotcha.
working, you just get stuck with it. So practice will really help you realize which one which one.
All right, I got 2 more minutes. Let's do a couple more practices. First test stuff, right hip flexion, right hip extension. The illusion is you may want to say when leg goes back, that has to be extension. It doesn't have to be extension. Extension would be fake if I literally move the hip. Today, we just did the same illusions, just in 2 other planes. So we did flexion, extension, flexion, extension, and then we did external, internal, external, internal. We did abduction, adduction, abduction, adduction. And instead of bilateral flexion, bilateral extension, I can't do bilateral ab and adduction because friction. Like I'd have to get my feet off the ground in order to do it. Does that make sense? So my only option to move both hips in a closed chain is to do one of each, to have up on one and add in the other. And the only way I can do bilateral internal and external is to get my feet off the ground for significant motion. So my only option to move both hips significantly is to have one do one and the other do the other. Internal, external, internal, external. Make sense? All right, guys, you have a good weekend. Thank you, Lindsay. Well done.